I was labeling an old reel-to-reel tape I had no equipment left to actually play. An old habit from 40 years spent behind a radio microphone. When I turned on my own car radio during an ordinary Tuesday errand and heard the station's own afternoon announcer introduce my daughter-in-law as the show's new solo host, carrying forward a beloved local tradition all on her own. I remember pulling over to the side of the road slowly, my own hand still resting on the volume dial, right before that announcement rearranged the entire shape of that afternoon. I had no idea that within the same broadcast, my own name would be mentioned only once, briefly, as the show's original founder, in a tone reserved for describing something firmly in the past tense, and that within the following week, I would contact the station's own management directly, invoke the specific trademark and format ownership I had personally registered decades earlier, and formally pull the show's actual name off the air entirely. My name is Philippa Northrup. I'm 74 years old. I spent 40 years hosting a daily call-in radio program, the kind of career that teaches you that a person's own voice and the specific name people come to trust that voice by carries real, protectable value, and teaches you, too, that handing someone the microphone temporarily is an entirely different thing from handing them permanent ownership of what that microphone actually represents. My husband Aurelius died 5 years ago. A sudden heart attack in our own home studio. Collapsed at his own engineering board moments after helping me sign off one final broadcast together. The kind of ordinary Thursday evening that gave no warning at all. I remember turning around to ask if he wanted to grab dinner and finding him already on the floor beside the very equipment he'd maintained faithfully for decades. Grief that arrives in the middle of the work you both loved teaches you something particular. It teaches you that the click of a microphone switching on can undo you completely for years afterward, and that you learn slowly to keep broadcasting anyway, because the alternative is letting an entire audience's trust go untended. I started the show 40 years ago, a modest local call-in program originally meant to run for a single summer season, offering practical advice and a sympathetic ear to callers navigating everything from difficult marriages to difficult mortgages. It found, almost immediately, a devoted regional following, and over 4 decades, it became something considerably larger than either Aurelius or I ever imagined. A genuine local institution, its own specific name registered as a protected trademark, its particular format and structure carefully documented and legally protected specifically, so no future station management could ever simply rebrand or repackage something we'd built so deliberately. After Aurelius died, continuing that show, exactly the way we'd built it together, became something closer to sacred to me. The clearest remaining trace of decades spent building something meaningful in partnership with him. Aurelius and I built our life together slowly, the unglamorous way most honest things get built. He worked as an audio engineer for nearly 40 years, meticulous with every soundboard adjustment, the kind of man who could hear a single crackle of static in an otherwise clean broadcast that everyone else in the room had missed entirely. When I told him 3 years into our marriage that I wanted to pitch my own call-in show to the station rather than continue as a part-time production assistant, he didn't tell me it would be difficult with a young family at home. He told me he'd handle the engineering booth himself, every single broadcast. So I'd never once have to worry about the technical side going wrong, and he did, for 4 decades, without complaint. I built my own career slowly after that, the way most honest expertise gets built, one carefully handled caller at a time, 40 years behind the microphone until I finally began scaling back with more patience than I sometimes believed I had any right to feel. I remember one particular young broadcaster early in my own career, a woman convinced she'd never develop the composure needed to handle a genuinely difficult live caller, whom I spent an entire season quietly mentoring after our shared shifts, never once mentioning to the station manager how much extra time it actually required. She went on to host her own successful program at a considerably larger market station for over 2 decades. And years later, a letter arrived thanking me for refusing to let her give up on her own instincts. I think about that letter often now, in a different light than I once did. Understanding that quiet, uncredited mentorship had always been the actual substance of my working life, long before I ever imagined needing that same instinct applied to protecting my own show's actual legacy. I have 2 children. Cassia, my daughter, is a hospital administrator, 3 time zones away, precise and steady in exactly the way you'd hope an administrator's judgment would be. She calls every Sunday evening without fail, a habit that started the year Aurelius died and never once lapsed since. My son Bartholomew is 43, a station engineer himself, married for 6 years to a woman named Zara Winterborn, 35, whose growing career as an on-air broadcaster he has supported personally since they met, and who has always had a particular gift for making her own professional ambitions sound like natural succession. Zara grew up in a family that valued visible personal achievement considerably more than collaborative shared credit, the kind of household where standing at the center of something mattered more than honestly acknowledging whose foundation you were actually standing on. I don't say that to excuse what eventually happened. I say it because understanding where someone's hunger for a solo spotlight comes from doesn't mean you're obligated to keep feeding that hunger forever, especially once it starts consuming a show that carries your own name and 40 years of your own actual work. She told me a story once, early in her relationship with Bartholomew, back when we still spoke easily and often, about her own mother's habit of describing every family group project, from school fundraisers to community theater productions, as though she had led it entirely herself, regardless of how many other people had actually done the work alongside her. My mom always said someone has to be the face of a project, and it might as well be you, she told me. I grew up believing that becoming the visible center of something mattered more than accurately describing who actually built it together. I remember thinking at the time that it explained a certain confident ambition in her, worthy of real admiration. I didn't yet understand that she had absorbed an entire framework built around claiming sole visibility rather than honest collaboration, and that a show carrying my own name would eventually become the thing that framework was applied to without my consent. Bartholomew met Zara at the station itself, where she'd been hired as a weekend fill-in broadcaster fresh out of her own broadcasting program. And I remember the first time he brought her by my own home studio, watching her ask thoughtful, genuinely curious questions about how I'd built the show's own format from scratch decades earlier, wanting to understand not just what worked, but why I'd made each specific structural decision. I remember thinking, watching that first visit, how naturally she seemed to understand exactly what made good radio actually work. I would think about that first visit considerably more, in a different light, once I understood how selectively that same understanding eventually got applied. About 2 years ago, following a health scare that made extended studio hours considerably harder for me to manage alone, I brought Zara on as a co-host, genuinely grateful for her own broadcasting talent and eager to share the microphone with someone I trusted completely, given her marriage into my own family. I did insist, with the station's own management, on a formal co-hosting agreement clearly specifying that the show's name, format, and trademark remained entirely mine, that Zara's role was explicitly co-host rather than any form of ownership transfer, and that any future change to that arrangement required my own direct, written approval. Everyone involved agreed readily to those terms. It would take 2 years of careful creeping erosion before I understood exactly how much that agreement was actually protecting. For the first year of our co-hosting arrangement, everything felt like exactly what I'd hoped it would be. Zara's own genuine talent bringing real energy to the show, our two voices working together naturally, callers responding warmly to the partnership. The first time I noticed something beginning to shift was about 14 months in, when the station's own promotional materials began describing the show as Zara's fresh, modern take on a classic format, framing her own involvement as creative reinvention rather than accurately describing our actual co hosting arrangement. I mentioned this to the station's own promotions department, and they corrected the language promptly, though I noted with some discomfort that Zara hadn't mentioned the discrepancy to me herself before I discovered it independently. The second incident happened when I began needing to reduce my own on air hours further, following a second, more serious health complication. And Zara offered to cover considerably more solo airtime during my recovery. A genuinely reasonable and generous offer at the time that I accepted gratefully, never suspecting that solo coverage would gradually become something considerably more permanent than the temporary arrangement we'd actually discussed. The third incident happened when I discovered, entirely by accident, that Zara had been giving interviews to local media outlets, describing her own vision for the show's future direction, discussing planned format changes and thematic shifts, without ever mentioning that any such changes would require my own direct approval as the show's actual owner and trademark holder. The fourth incident happened when I overheard Zara on a call with the station's own general manager, discussing an upcoming contract renewal in language that referred to the show as her own program going forward, a description that made no mention of my own continued involvement or my own actual ownership of the underlying format and trademark itself. The fifth incident happened during a planning conversation for the show's own upcoming anniversary special, sitting in the station's own conference room with a production calendar spread between us. When Zara mentioned, almost as an aside, that given my own continued health limitations, it might make more sense for the anniversary special itself to focus primarily on her own vision for the show's future, rather than an extended retrospective of my own decades hosting it. "Philippa, you understand, right?" she said, glancing at me with a practiced, reasonable smile. "It's not about erasing the history. It's just about what actually keeps the show relevant going forward." I sat there listening to my daughter-in-law discuss minimizing 40 years of my own actual work at the very event meant to celebrate it, as though decades of building this show from nothing were an inconvenient retrospective rather than the very foundation any future the show might have was actually built upon. The sixth incident happened when Zara's own mother, meeting me at a family gathering, mentioned how impressed she was watching her daughter step into such a significant broadcasting role with such natural confidence. "She's always had that gift," she said, beaming, "for taking an opportunity and truly making it her own." I said nothing to correct her, the same way I'd said nothing to correct anyone else directly, though I remember driving home afterward feeling the particular loneliness of being the only person in an entire extended family who actually understood how thoroughly my own 40 years of work were being quietly recategorized as raw material for someone else's fresh start. The seventh incident is the one I think about most, because it's the one where I should have said something more directly and didn't. It happened when a regional broadcasting industry publication ran a feature describing the show's own recent creative resurgence under Zara's leadership, mentioning my own name only briefly, as a footnote describing the program's original host, rather than its actual continuing owner. I read that feature at my own kitchen table, Aurelius's own old engineering notes, still tucked into a nearby drawer, understanding that my own decades of work had somehow already begun disappearing from the show's own public story, before any formal transition had ever actually been agreed to. The eighth incident happened when I overheard Zara on a call with a talent agent expressing interest in a potential syndication deal. describing herself in that early exploratory conversation as the creator of a distinctive new format for call-in radio, language that made no mention of a format I had personally developed and legally documented 4 decades earlier, long before Zara had ever sat behind a microphone at all. I didn't understand yet that splinters left alone don't disappear. They work their way deeper. I want to tell you that I confronted this early, that I was the kind of woman who draws a firm line the moment she's disrespected. I wasn't. I told myself 100 different stories to avoid dealing with the truth. Zara is just building her own career the way ambitious broadcasters do. Bartholomew loves me, even if he doesn't correct her firmly enough. The show is still technically mine, whatever the promotional materials say, and that should be enough. I believed every one of those stories, some days more than others, because believing them was easier than accepting that 40 years of my own actual work had become raw material in someone else's more marketable fresh start. There was one afternoon about 2 months before everything finally came to a head when I came close to saying something. Zara called to ask whether I'd be comfortable if the station handled the upcoming contract renewal primarily through her own office, given my own limited stamina for extended negotiation meetings, framing the request as simple practicality rather than a departure from what we'd actually agreed. I sat with the phone in my hand afterward, feeling something rise up in me that felt very close to the surface, very close to finally saying out loud everything I'd swallowed for nearly 2 years. Then I thought about Bartholomew's own happiness, about how much this opportunity had already come to mean to his wife's own career, about how a fight over ownership would only ever complicate something he was genuinely proud of her for building. I agreed, reluctantly, and told myself one more time that the moment to say something hadn't quite arrived yet. Looking back, I understand now that I was wrong about that. The moment had arrived long before. I simply hadn't been ready to stand inside it yet. Then came that ordinary Tuesday drive. I was running an ordinary errand, the car radio tuned, out of habit, to the very station I'd broadcast on for 4 decades, when the afternoon announcer's own voice came through clearly, introducing an upcoming special segment celebrating the show's transition to its new solo host, carrying forward a beloved local tradition, all on her own. A tradition the announcer described, warmly and at some length, as though it had simply always belonged to the person now stepping fully into it. My own name appeared only once, in a single sentence describing the program's original founder, spoken in exactly the tone reserved for describing something firmly, permanently in the past. I pulled over to the side of the road, my own hands still on the wheel, and sat there for a long moment, understanding with total clarity exactly what I needed to do. I called my old friend Nathaniel before I called the station directly, a man I'd worked alongside for over 3 decades in the same regional broadcasting circuit, needing to hear a voice that understood exactly how much a protected name and format actually mattered. I told him the whole story. 2 years of gradual erosion, the broadcast I'd just heard, my own name reduced to a single past tense sentence. He listened without interrupting, his own coffee going cold in front of him. "Philippa," he finally said, "you spent 40 years teaching every young broadcaster who came through that station exactly how much a trusted name actually protects, and why letting anyone casually claim it undermines the whole relationship with an audience. I don't think that principle stops applying just because the person claiming it happens to be family herself." "I keep waiting to feel guilty about what I'm about to do," I told him, "and it isn't coming." "Maybe it isn't coming," Nathaniel said, "because there's nothing here to feel guilty about. You didn't ask to disappear from your own show's future. You're simply refusing to let that disappearance continue one single day longer than it already has." I called the station's own general manager directly the following morning, reminding her formally of the specific trademark and format ownership documentation on file. Ownership that had never once been transferred or modified by any agreement I'd actually signed. The general manager, genuinely concerned once she understood the situation, confirmed that the station's own legal department would need to review the entire matter immediately. Given that continuing to broadcast under a protected name without the actual owner's current authorization created real legal exposure for the station itself. I called my attorney, a sharp, longtime professional acquaintance named Isolde Kavanagh, whom I'd worked with years earlier during the show's original trademark registration decades before. I explained the pattern plainly: 2 years of gradual authorial erosion, the announcer's own broadcast, my own name reduced to a single past tense sentence on the very airwaves I'd built. Philippa, she said, your trademark and format documentation is clear and specific. What the station has been broadcasting constitutes use of your own protected name and format without your current active authorization for exactly the framing they've been using. Let's discuss exactly how you want to enforce that protection, understanding that you have real legally documented authority here. Those first few days after that drive were harder than I expected. I found myself more than once reaching for the phone to call Isolde and tell her to hold off, that surely there was some gentler way to make my point without formally intervening in Zara's on-air position. I sat in my own home studio one entire evening, Aurelius's own engineering notes spread across the console he'd maintained for decades, trying to remind myself exactly what I was protecting before I let the decision go any further. Each time, I made myself sit with the discomfort a little longer instead of acting on it, remembering Nathaniel's words, remembering the actual weight of hearing my own work described in the past tense, remembering that gentler corrections had already had nearly 2 years to work and hadn't. I want to be clear about what I did and did not do, because I think it matters. I did not attempt to have Zara removed from broadcasting entirely, nor did I seek to damage her career out of pure anger. Isolde drafted a formal notice to the station and to Zara directly, citing the specific trademark documentation, revoking authorization for the show's protected name and format to continue being used under the current solo host framing, and requiring any continued use of that specific name to accurately reflect my own ongoing ownership and involvement, with my own direct written approval required for any future transition. Bartholomew called the following morning, his voice tight with panic rather than his usual calm. Mom, this could end Zara's entire on-air position at the station overnight. I understand that's difficult, I said calmly. But she's been building a public identity around a show whose actual name and format belong to me, gradually positioning herself as its sole owner while I was managing real health limitations. Right up until I heard, on my own car radio, that my 40 years of work had apparently already become the past tense. I'm not trying to end her career. I'm asking that a name I built and legally protected actually be used the way it was always meant to be, with me still genuinely part of it. There has to be another way to handle this that doesn't end her position at the station entirely. There is, I said. If Zara is willing to sit down with me and negotiate an honest, properly documented transition plan, one that accurately credits both of our roles at every stage rather than quietly erasing mine, I'm entirely open to eventually stepping back from daily hosting duties in a way that's actually fair to both of us. I'm not interested in ending her career. I'm interested in making certain a name I built isn't simply handed over by default, because nobody bothered to have an honest conversation about it. Zara called. 2 days later, her voice sharp. Philippa, this is completely disproportionate. The station's own promotional department wrote that language, not me. No, I said quietly. I'm the woman who watched you spend 2 years quietly positioning yourself as this show's sole future, accepting every promotional description that erased my own ongoing ownership without once correcting the record yourself. I think the real question is what you thought would happen once I actually heard, on my own car radio, exactly how far that positioning had gone. I was only trying to secure my own place at the station during a genuinely uncertain time. I believe that you believed that, I said, but securing your own place was never meant to require quietly erasing mine. Those are very different things, Zara, and I think some part of you has always understood the difference, which is exactly why you never once corrected any of those descriptions yourself, even when you had every opportunity to. She hung up on me. I sat with the dial tone for a long moment, then returned to my own quiet home studio, understanding that whatever came next would take considerable time to settle. The weeks that followed were difficult ones. Bartholomew called nearly every day at first, caught between his wife's genuine distress over her own career and a growing understanding of exactly how far the public erasure had actually gone. Cassia, once she heard the whole story, offered to fly in and sit with Bartholomew directly, walking him through the full timeline the way only a sibling who'd grown up listening to our own family's show every single evening could properly convey. She told me later that she'd pulled up recordings of several of our own earliest broadcasts, playing them for Bartholomew directly, watching his face change as he heard, with real attention, exactly how much work had gone into building something he'd simply grown up assuming would always exist. I don't think he understood how deliberate every single decision actually was until he heard you and Dad working through it live, Cassia told me. He kept saying, I always just thought of it as the show. It was never just the show, Cassia told him. It was 40 years of two people building something on purpose, one difficult decision at a time. About 2 weeks after my formal notice went out, Bartholomew asked if I'd be willing to join a call with him and Zara together, something he described, a little awkwardly, as trying to find a way forward that didn't destroy either Zara's own career or this family's own relationships. I agreed, genuinely hoping we could resolve this honestly. When the call connected, Bartholomew sat beside Zara at their own kitchen table, her expression carefully arranged into something between contrition and defensiveness. Mom, Bartholomew began, we wanted to talk through everything properly, figure out what happens next for all of us. I'm listening, I said. Zara spoke first, her voice tighter than I'd heard it before. I think I genuinely got swept up in an opportunity that felt bigger than anything I'd ever been offered professionally, especially watching you struggle with your own health. I know accepting that solo host framing without correcting it was wrong, but a formal legal notice threatening my entire on-air position feels like it's designed to end my career at exactly the wrong moment. Was that the intention? I considered the question honestly before answering. The intention was to stop watching a name I built over 40 years get quietly claimed by someone else's growing platform. If it threatens a position you've built around that claim, I understand that it might. It should, a little. 2 years of gradual erasure doesn't undo itself painlessly just because the reason it's ending is a fair one. I could lose the position entirely if this becomes a public legal dispute at the station, Zara said, her composure cracking slightly. Is that really what you wanted? Really What I wanted, I said, was to stop hearing my own decades of work described in the past tense on my own car radio. I never once asked you to stay silent about your own genuine contribution. I only asked, from the very beginning, that my own actual ownership remain clearly, publicly part of the show's story. And somewhere along the way, that condition stopped being honored at all. Bartholomew was quiet for a long moment, and then he turned toward Zara directly, his voice low but clear enough for me to hear as well. You had opportunities to correct every single one of those descriptions, he said. The magazine feature, the general manager's own contract language. You didn't. I don't understand how 2 years of watching mom manage real health struggles while still legally owning this entire show became something you thought you were entitled to simply inherit by default. Zara's eyes filled, and for the first time in the entire call, she didn't have a rebuttal ready. I don't know how to fix something that started with me genuinely wanting an opportunity I'd worked hard for, she said, almost to herself. You start by correcting the public record honestly, every single time it comes up from now on, I told her, starting immediately with the station itself. Given Zara's genuine willingness to correct course honestly, my attorney, the station, and I worked together to issue a formal public correction, one that plainly, clearly credited me as the show's founding host and continuing owner, with Zara positioned honestly as co-host during an active, ongoing transition, a distinction she herself insisted on stating explicitly, unprompted, in every subsequent on air segment going forward. About 3 weeks later, Bartholomew came to see me alone, sitting across from me at my own kitchen table. I keep thinking about growing up listening to you and Dad in that studio every single evening, he said. I don't know when I started thinking of the show as something that would just naturally pass to whoever was standing closest to the microphone. Instead of understanding it was actually your entire life's work, built specifically, deliberately, by the two of you. Thank you for saying that now, I told him. Why didn't you say something sooner before it went this far? Because I kept telling myself it wasn't really about ownership, he said. It was about whether your actual legacy survived being quietly absorbed or got smoothed into something easier to hand off. I think I forgot that a natural transition and a quiet erasure aren't automatically the same thing. Zara came to see me on her own several weeks later, considerably more subdued than our earlier call had been, sitting stiffly across from me at my own kitchen table. I keep thinking about how close I came to actually losing this entire opportunity, and how much fear about my own career security drove decisions I'm not proud of, she admitted, before we'd even gotten to the harder parts of the conversation. I know I have complicated feelings about how this happened, Philippa, but some part of this was just about genuinely wanting to prove I could build something significant with my own name attached to it, especially after watching you struggle with your health so visibly. That desire is entirely understandable, I told her gently. I never doubted your genuine talent or your ambition. I only ever wanted my own actual ownership of something I built over 40 years to remain clearly, publicly mine, for as long as I'm still actively part of it. She nodded, wiping her eyes, and continued. I've been thinking about everything, she admitted, about how easily wanting security for my own career turned into believing I was entitled to simply absorb something that was never fully mine to claim. I think I convinced myself that a cleaner, solo narrative would make the transition easier for everyone, so I stopped correcting the moments where that narrative started erasing you entirely. You were never entitled to simply absorb this show, Zara, I told her. But you were always entitled to ask me directly, honestly, about what a genuinely fair transition might actually look like. Those are very different paths, and only one of them was ever actually available to you. I don't know how to undo 2 years of building toward that erasure, she said. You don't undo it, I told her. You start correcting it publicly every single time it comes up, and let the story going forward finally be told honestly. We talked for nearly 2 hours that afternoon about Aurelius, about the studio, about what this show had actually been built to carry. I showed her Aurelius's own original engineering notes from the very first broadcast, 40 years earlier, his careful handwriting documenting exactly how we'd built the format together from nothing. Zara read through those pages slowly, her hands careful, before asking if she could help me properly document for the station's own historical record. exactly how the show's actual history unfolded. So any future transition started from complete honesty rather than gradual erosion. By the end of that conversation, something between us had shifted, not fully repaired, but genuinely, honestly begun. Bartholomew and Zara began seeing a counselor together that autumn, specifically to address the underlying fear and ambition driving how Zara approached professional security, something neither of them had properly examined before. Zara told me later that the counselor had asked them, in an early session, to describe the single biggest unspoken assumption underlying how they'd approach this professional transition. We both said inevitability, almost at the same time, Zara said. Neither of us had ever said out loud how much of what we called a natural transition actually depended on quietly claiming something that was never simply hers to inherit. I called Isolde a few weeks after the formal notice went out to update her on how everything had actually unfolded since the correction had moved forward, faster than either of us expected. Philippa, I've handled a lot of these trademark and format disputes over the years, she said. And I can tell you what you did wasn't reckless. It was actually one of the more disciplined uses of a protected format ownership I've seen a client execute in 20 years of practice. I told her I hadn't thought of it in those terms, that it had felt, in the moment, more like an act of pure hurt than discipline. Sometimes the two aren't as far apart as people assume, she said. You understood decades ago exactly how easily a beloved name can slip away from its rightful owner once someone else starts speaking for it publicly. The fact that you eventually needed to enforce that protection doesn't make you any less careful for having built it into the trademark documentation in the first place. Cassia flew in for the show's own considerably more honest anniversary special that spring, rescheduled and reworked entirely, a genuine retrospective celebrating 40 years of the show's actual history. Zara herself introducing extended archival segments of my own decades hosting it, describing her own role clearly as the broadcaster fortunate enough to now be sharing that legacy actively with me rather than replacing it. Over the small celebration afterward, Cassia's own husband asked, carefully, how the whole situation had eventually settled, having heard only fragments of the story secondhand. The room quieted for a moment, the kind of quiet that had become familiar to this family over the past year, before Zara simply said, I let wanting security turn into almost erasing the entire history that made this show worth being part of at all. Philippa made sure I understood exactly what that would have cost. I'm still working to earn back the trust that cost. Nobody looked away uncomfortably. Nobody needed the subject changed. Zara called her own mother that same autumn, correcting, at last, the way she'd absorbed that particular family habit of claiming sole visibility for collaborative work. Bartholomew told me she'd come off the phone looking wrung out, describing her mother's reaction as a long, uncomfortable silence, followed by a quiet admission that she'd always privately wondered whether that habit had ever actually cost anyone something real, watching it modeled her entire life without ever fully questioning it. She sent me a brief note not long after, considerably more restrained than Bartholomew's or Zara's own, but genuine in its own careful way, thanking me for correcting a picture of ownership she'd apparently helped normalize without ever fully considering the cost. A few weeks after that special aired, a card arrived in my mailbox, Bartholomew's familiar handwriting on the envelope. Inside, he'd written considerably more than a few lines. Mom, I keep thinking about all the months I let Zara's version of this transition become the only version anyone heard, including me. I can't undo that, but I can promise to actually listen every single time when you tell me something about the show feels wrong. Thank you for making certain 40 years of your actual work survived being turned into someone else's fresh start. Tucked inside the same envelope was a considerably longer letter in Zara's own handwriting. Philippa, I spent 2 years building a public identity around a legacy that was never mine to claim as my own solo platform. I'm sorry it took hearing yourself erased on your own car radio for me to understand exactly what that claiming actually cost you. I folded both letters carefully and placed them in a small drawer beside Aurelius's own original engineering notes, a small permanent record of exactly how seriously that ownership had always needed to be protected. I saw Nathaniel again that summer, over coffee at the same small cafe where we talked through everything the week of that difficult drive. I told him about the correction, the counseling, the honest anniversary special. Nathaniel listened with the same quiet satisfaction he'd shown from the very beginning. I told you it would matter holding that line, he said. Most people don't have the nerve to actually do it, even when they know they should. You did, and look what it actually protected, not just the show, the truth back. I thought about that phrase for days afterward, understanding that it described exactly what had actually been at stake the entire time. Do you regret any of it? Nathaniel asked gently. The 2 years of gradual erosion before you finally acted. I regret the silence, I told him. I don't regret trusting Zara with the microphone originally, or the family, or even the patience I gave before finally reaching my limit. I think I needed all of it, in some strange way, to finally understand exactly what I was protecting when I registered that trademark decades ago. I think about that ordinary Tuesday drive often, my own hand still on the wheel, the announcer's own voice describing my life's work in the past tense over airwaves I'd built from nothing. At the moment, it felt like the end of something. Looking back now, I understand it was actually the beginning of something else entirely. A family finally required to reckon honestly with the legacy it had been quietly editing. I don't regret bringing Zara onto that microphone freely. Bartholomew's happiness mattered to me then, and it still does. What I regret is how long I allowed 40 years of my own actual work to be quietly repositioned as someone else's fresh start before I finally insisted the record reflect reality. A name built with genuine care was never meant to require its founder's disappearance as the price of honest succession. And I intend to make certain my own voice remains part of this show's story for as long as I'm able to speak into that microphone at all. I think, too, about all the years I spent believing that quiet generosity was itself sufficient protection, that a good mother-in-law simply trusted her family's ambitions without ever needing anything formally enforced to protect her own actual legacy underneath them. I no longer believe that. Trusting shared understanding to protect itself isn't sufficient. It's simply a slower, quieter kind of erosion, and it costs exactly as much in the end, whether you name it out loud or not. The difference is only in how long you wait to formally protect what actually matters. I think about the specific moments now with a clarity I didn't have while I was living inside them. The promotional language describing fresh reinvention, the interviews given without my own knowledge, the industry feature that reduced 40 years to a single footnote. Each one seemed small enough to excuse in isolation. Strung together, they formed something considerably less innocent. A pattern deliberate enough that I no longer believe, looking back, that the solo host announcement was an isolated lapse rather than the culmination of 2 years of careful, escalating repositioning. Zara may not have consciously planned each individual step, but the cumulative effect served a purpose she understood on some level, even if she never named it to herself, keeping my own ongoing ownership small enough that a cleaner, more marketable solo narrative could take its place. Real succession, I've come to believe, was never actually about choosing between honoring a legacy and building genuine opportunity for the next person carrying it forward. It was about protecting both, clearly and simultaneously, rather than letting one quietly absorb the other, because absorption felt more convenient in an uncertain moment. If a collaborator needs you to disappear from your own life's work in order to build a cleaner public platform, that discomfort is telling you something important, and it deserves an immediate, direct response, not a patient wait and see approach. I think of it now the way I used to think about a caller whose actual question got quietly reframed into something easier for the show to answer neatly. You can let that reframing stand if you want to. It never once serves the person who actually called in the first place. It only continues quietly until someone finally insists the original question be heard honestly. I think sometimes about all those years behind that microphone, learning that every honest broadcast depends on the actual person whose story it is remaining clearly, audibly present in it. It took me 74 years and one very ordinary Tuesday drive to apply that same standard fully to my own life's work. I welcomed Zara onto that microphone freely, and I would welcome a genuine collaborator again exactly the same way. But I no longer accept a version of succession that requires my own disappearance from something I built over 4 decades. If I am the one who created that name and protected it deliberately, I intend to remain the one whose voice it carries, not because I distrust everyone who helps me, but because pretending otherwise was never generosity. It was only ever a kindness to someone else's more convenient platform, purchased at the cost of my own life's work. The show airs every weekday afternoon now, exactly the way it always should have. Zara always asking me directly now, before any promotional description or public appearance connected to it, exactly how I'd like our shared history framed, rather than assuming any narrative remains hers to decide alone. Cassia flew in specially for one of the show's own recent milestone broadcasts, standing near the studio's own observation window with genuine warmth on her face, watching Zara ask me, plainly, whether a particular story she wanted to share on air actually felt right to tell before she committed to sharing it at all. I felt something settle in my chest that had been unsettled for nearly 2 years. I am 74 years old, a widow, a retired broadcaster who never quite managed full retirement, a mother and grandmother who still shows up for the people she loves whenever she's needed. But I am no longer a woman who quietly trusts her own life's work to remain hers, simply because it should, without ever formally protecting that ownership herself. That particular version of me stayed behind on the side of an ordinary road, along with a car radio broadcast that introduced my own 40 years of work as something firmly, permanently in the past. I pulled over that afternoon as one woman, and I drove away as another, and I have never once wished myself back into the first one. Sometimes people ask me if I'd do anything differently. If given the chance to go back to the day I first brought Zara onto that microphone, knowing everything I know now, I tell them the truth. I would welcome her again, exactly the same way, because her genuine talent and her initial excitement about the opportunity were never the mistake. The mistake was assuming that a formal agreement alone would naturally protect something as specific and essential as my own continued voice in a legacy I'd spent 40 years building, that decades of careful, deliberate work could survive on their own weight without anyone occasionally insisting they be honored directly, in public when it actually mattered most. If I could change one thing, it wouldn't be the trust I extended. It would be the 2 years of small corrections I let slide, corrections I mistook again and again for graciousness rather than what they actually were, a slow and quiet surrender of my own life's actual authorship. A longtime listener, a woman who told me she'd been calling into the show since she was newly divorced and barely coping nearly 30 years earlier, wrote in after the corrected anniversary special aired, thanking us for finally telling the whole story honestly. I always assumed the show just belonged to whoever happened to be hosting it that particular year, she wrote. Hearing the real history made me understand it actually belonged to someone specific the entire time, and that mattered more than I expected it to. I read that letter twice, understanding that the correction had mattered to people considerably beyond my own immediate family. My own grandchildren ask me now, whenever they visit the studio, to tell them the real story behind the show, not the polished promotional version, but the actual history underneath it. The summer it was only ever supposed to run one season. The decades it grew into something considerably larger. The difficult year its own future nearly got quietly rewritten without me. I tell it every single time exactly the same way, unhurried and complete, no detail softened, no chapter left unspoken, watching them absorb a history that finally, completely belongs to the woman who actually built every single broadcast of it. These days, when anyone asks about the show still airing under a name I registered 40 years ago, they hear the whole story, the single planned season, the decades of genuine growth, a difficult year that nearly rewrote the whole thing before honesty finally, deliberately won out. I'm simply, finally, exactly as present in my own life's work as I always should have been.